globalization is the international phenomenon of the world coming together of different countries and civilizations. What we must understand firstly is that globalization is not something that was engineered, but rather was a phenomenon that came about as different countries became more and more interdependent on each other, aided together by the advancement of technology in terms of communication and secondary transport. And simply put, globalization is when the world is smaller and there's increasing interdependence between countries. That is the reality of today's debate. I perpetuate this type of truth that how globalization actively continues the idea of social inequity. Social inequity, as defined by the proposition, comes in three forms. Firstly, the idea of economically. Secondly, the idea of culture. Thirdly, the idea of politically. And we must understand that all are not divorced from each other. And if one portion of our definition has inequity, is usually experienced in the other areas. Therefore, this house will prove that my side will prove how globalization has perpetuated this social inequity both between and within countries, and they will have therefore had the burden to prove otherwise. Therefore, moving on to my case vision, I as the first speaker will be talking about how developing nations marginalize the developing and undeveloped countries, while my second speaker will be talking about how even within the developed countries, social inequity is still present, and therefore my side will conclusively prove to you that globalization has perpetuated the idea of social equity. We clarify today that globalization is not as if the third world has no benefits. However, we say that the globalization has caused a gap that has been perpetuated because of the increasing interdependence, and that is why we say that this motion must stand. Now moving on to my case division, where I shall be talking about how developing nations marginalize developing and undeveloped nations, in which I shall be dealing with our three main ideas of social inequity. Firstly, economically. Secondly, the idea of culture. And lastly, on the idea of politically. Now moving on to economically. We see that globalization comes with it free trade, because free trade is a subset of globalization, which means the lowering of barriers for the women's stuff. And we see that the first world MNCs have used it and marginalized the third world by using it for only their own benefit. Yes, madam?
So we see that both parties actually benefit, because what happens is when these embassies enter the country, the local itself will actually stand to gain from jobs, and in the end, the economy will be kick-started.
Yes, madam, but we must understand what kind of jobs are you putting forth to these people? What kind of jobs are you making do? They are not doing high-level jobs. Moreover, what the MNCs do is they employ them to do menial labor, to employ them to operate the factories and the machines in the country itself. No, thank you, sir. And we see that the first world MNCs are not giving that kind of technological transfer. They're not giving them any sort of kick-starting the economy as it's so report. Now, secondly, the idea of the brain drain. No, thank you, sir. Where we see that people will move away from their country if they are smart, if they're educated. Because they move to where the opportunities lie. They move to the places where they provide them with the most money and the most recognition for their work. No, thank you, madam. And we say that the brightest minds of different countries, perpetuated by the idea of globalization, where immigration and working between countries is becoming an increasing phenomenon. And we say that this is a detriment, this is something that globalization has perpetuated in terms of economy. Now moving on secondly on the idea of culture, where we say that we are diluting the culture because of the imposition of cultures, not by chance, ladies and gentlemen, but rather globalization has caused first world countries to be more often than not subverting the local culture, to move in the direction of popular culture, to move in the idea of listening to what the first world countries say. This is because globalization increases the access of different nations. A person in a third world country, no thank you, madam, is not only listening to what his local stations say nowadays, but rather they are looking at what the first world are saying as well. A recent study by the International Committee for the Review of Popular Media, the ICRL, current statistics in 2005 show that American television dominated 32.76% of broadcasting in third world nations, and also on the idea of radio, where they take for 17.34% is dominated by American voices, dominated by American opinion, and that is the current reality. That they will more often than not want to listen to these Americans because they are the ones with the money. They are the ones they are trying to emulate, because the idea is that they want the most money, they want to get the better job, and the only way to do that is to be more often than not subverting themselves into American culture. Secondly, on the idea of cultural language, how we say that globalization in itself has taken down the idea of domestic languages, has taken the idea of dialects, which we bring in the example of Japan itself, where the idea of Monogatsu language in the idea of Ryukyu Island, where these dialects have this dialect itself, a dialect that is an identity for Japan itself, is only culminated in one island itself, culminated where language as a whole is subverted to the idea of economics, subverted to the idea of catering to the Western mindset. We bring in also the example of Singapore, where they have assimilated the culture of the Americans itself. We bring in an example of a survey done by the Singapore Census Bureau, in which they took the idea that in the 1980s, 70% of households spoke Chinese in domestic at home. However, recently, the idea is 70% is now English. 60% of them now only want to talk English, because they want to be able to cater to the Western mindset, to cater to the first world countries, and globalization has really perpetuated that. Yes, sir.
This shows that there is a diversification of the people in these third world countries, and they're actually benefiting from it.
How are they benefiting from it when their culture is diluted? How are they benefiting from it if they lose sight of what is their own cultural identity? You have not proven, in your TOI state, you have not proven to me the fact that how globalization does not perpetuate this divide, which is the point of this motion today. Now, let's bring in the example of GDP as well. When the United States GDP, 12,360,000, but yet, no thank you sir, the idea of $60 GDP. That's the division that lies into this debate. That is the division that we say must be solved in this debate. And we bring in also the idea of politically, how people who have more money have more clout in the international community. Who has more money shout louder, and their opinions are taken more weight than a developing country with less than $70 of GDP. We bring that example of the International Economic Review held in Zurich in the March of 2002, where the first thing on the agenda was not on how we protect third world countries, but rather situations such as the International Space Station at a point in time, things such as trade barriers that are preventing the first world nation from getting into the third world nations. That is the views that are being heard in the international community, not the views of developing countries, but globalization has rather perpetuated the views of the first world countries and has subverted the third world nation into their ideology. And because we stand on the side of wanting everyone to have a better chance in life, they go with the proposition.
The House takes the first proposition speaker for this. Speakers spoke for 3 minutes and 5 seconds. May I now invite the first speaker of the opposition to open up the case on this side of the House.
Globalization is a process that essentially does not create the divide between the rich and the poor. It does not create the divide between the developing and the developed. In fact, it merges them together, benefiting both parties. And I will show you how this takes place in my following contentions. But before I do that, let me clear up the definition of social inequity that they have brought up. They have not shown us anything what is inequity. But let me clarify it out for the proposition on behalf. Firstly, social inequity is essentially means that there is a lack of fairness in the sharing of wealth or other opportunities for jobs and education between different nations in the world. This essentially means that globalization has got significant benefits for only one nation or one party. And this is exactly which we will disprove in today's motion, showing that globalization does not perpetuate social inequity. Now let me deal with the main contention that I have on that side of the House. Firstly, on how it marginalizes developing countries and how these people are only getting menial jobs and such stuff. We must understand that these people in the third world countries did not have any opportunities in the first place. when globalization is actually opening up the door for the MNCs to come in, they're actually opening up a large pool of jobs for these people to work in. They might be menial jobs, no, thank you sir, they might be menial jobs, or they might even be higher class jobs if they have the skills. But what is happening is that they are now able to work, get an income, and that is good for them in the third world. Not only this, these multinational companies now have an incentive to actually train these people because they're cheaper labor. They have the incentive to provide skills, education to them, so that they can actually take up the higher paid jobs as well, so that they can use these people to actually have them in their own country. And therefore, because the fact that the multinational companies are benefiting the third world, because of the fact that the multinational companies are profit motivated and actually helping these people develop, we show that it is actually benefiting the third world. Moreover, they talk to us about the brain drain. We have to understand that this brain drain does not take place. Because of globalization, we're actually opening up a large pool of opportunities in their home countries itself. These people are now able to stay in their home countries and get a much better job. They're able to stay in their home countries and get a much better education. So there's no incentive for them at all to move to another country altogether where there's a new culture, where there's a new environment. And that is why they would not do that. They would stay in their home country and they would benefit from the fact that globalization is actually bringing to them. Now let me move on to the idea of cultures being diluted. This will not happen again, because globalization essentially creates a diversity of culture. You're bringing in more cultures into the already local cultures that you have. This does not mean that the local cultures are eroded, because we still have Hindu practices in India, we still have Chinese cultural practices during Chinese New Year in China. It does not mean that when there's an Americanization, they only celebrate the American Independence Day, or they only celebrate the American New Year. These cultures are still upheld. What is more is that these cultures are also traveling to the developed countries, in which there is an intermingling of culture in the developed countries, and these Americans are actually benefiting from the Chinese culture, benefiting from the Indian culture, and this shows us that the globalization has not perpetuated social inequity. Now let us talk about the global language that they talked about. The fact that there is diversification, the fact that these third world countries can now benefit from an international language is vast. The fact that these people are now actually benefiting from English as a global language shows that these people have a greater incentive to improve themselves, greater incentive to have a better skill level, and this shows that developing countries are actually benefiting from the fact that there's a global language. Not only this, again, the developed countries are benefiting from the languages of these third world nations. We see that the universities in many of these third world countries actually require a mother tongue, actually require people to take foreign language classes so that these languages are not eradicated from our society today. This again shows us that globalization is actually not causing the perpetuation of social inequity. Now let me move on. Having dealt with all the contentions with that side of the house, let me move on to my case proper. I, as the first speaker, will show you how globalization actually causes benefits for the third world and developing countries. And secondly, I will show you how globalization creates a more competitive market. But my second speaker will be showing you how there is a two-way check in developing and developed countries in globalization, and how it increases international diplomacy. Now on to my point proper. Globalization causes large amounts of benefits for developing countries. You must understand that globalization essentially opens up trade and transport between a large number of countries. This essentially means that the multinational companies from developed countries are now able to come in and establish themselves in the developing countries. Now, how does this benefit the developing countries? Because now the multinational companies, because they have such a large pool of jobs available, all the people in the developing countries who do not have jobs are now being employed by the multinational companies. But they cannot just be employed like that by the multinational companies. What the multinational companies are now doing is now they're imparting education, imparting skills to the people of the third world nation, so that these people can actually benefit, develop, and now work in the multinational companies so that it prospers both. Both the multinational companies prospers both the third world nations. And because they're now setting up infrastructures, hold on a minute, sir. So infrastructure such as schools, they're setting up infrastructure such as roads in the third world countries, which were not present in the first place. This shows us that the third world country is actually developing. Yes, sir.
So even if the third world workers do benefit so much from themselves, we tell you that at the end of the day, there is still financial inequity in the sense that the first world nations still benefit more financially.
Sir, we must understand that these people were a third world nation where they could not even have the way in which they manipulate their own resources, use their own resources. By this globalization, we are now encouraging these people in the third world to actually use their resources for a beneficial purpose. And this shows us that both parties actually develop. We saw this in the case of ExxonMobil when they went into Senegal. They actually created a large number of infrastructure schools for people in Senegal, and these people are actually benefiting from these schools, getting a better education now. Clearly showing us that the globalization has created an equal divide between the third world as well as the developed nations. Moving on to my second point, how I will show you that globalization essentially creates a more competitive market. Because of the influx of goods from various different nations, because now the borders are open, what happens is that each of these companies in the developed countries as well as developing countries become even more competitive. And when they become even more competitive, they want their goods to sell more. So what they do, they reduce the prices of their goods, yet they have to maintain the quality of their goods for them to sell. So now, essentially, globalization creates an idea in which we have got better goods, and yet we've got cheaper and more quality goods. Clearly showing us that it helps the third world nations as well as the first world nations because of the trade between them. And this shows us that the third world nations as well as the first world nations develop better because of globalization, because now we've got cheaper goods. And this clearly shows us because globalization essentially creates a competitive market where cheaper goods are supplied for developing and developed countries, because it benefits developing countries as a whole, clearly showing us that globalization does not perpetuate social inequity.
Before I actually move on to my own points of contention as well as my own constructive case, let's move back to the criteria that we have set on outside the house. And this also takes into account the definition that they tried to refine in their first speaker's case. Inequity basically implies that there is a divide. There is a gap in the benefits that the first world as well as the third world experiences. And we say that on the divide on the counts of culture, politics, and economics has failed to be proven on their side of the house. And therefore, at this point in the debate, the motion still stands. And before I move on to my 3-point contention, let it be said that the first opposition speaker has left my first speaker's substantive point on the political inequity completely untouched. Therefore, we will assume that it is left standing at this point in this debate. So having cleared those things up, ladies and gentlemen, let me now move on to my own points of contention. And my first will be that on the economic benefits that they say will occur because of globalization. Now, they have come up to us and said that in the realm of economics, globalization actually benefits both consumers as well as producers of third world nations. But we say that this is not true. And we also say from the very start that there is actually an inequality, there's a divide in the benefits that they experience. So on the part of the consumers, ladies and gentlemen, we say that these third world markets are in no way going to have the affording or the purchasing power of those in the third world. How exactly is equality actually going to be held in this case? And on the part of the producers, ladies and gentlemen, we say that inequity is actually entrenched and perpetuated because now these domestic markets are going to be marginalized by the first world markets and the first world producers, no thank you sir, who have greater abilities. And so that deals with the economic point. Now on the idea of imparting education and skills, my second contention, how there is a supposed transfer of knowledge and information from the first world to the third world through globalization. Now we say yes, we do acknowledge, as my first speaker has already clarified, that these third world nations do develop and do have a certain degree of benefits. But we say that this degree of benefits in no way matches up to the benefits that the first world in a moment madam actually experiences. And it's because of this discrepancy that we say the motion still stands. But before I move on, yes madam.
So we see the discrepancy is actually bridged because now when you globalization, at least you have jobs, at least you have money for these developing countries.
Now let me prove to you how this transfer of knowledge isn't going to really happen in the first place. How so? We say because of the profit motive that they inform to us, because these companies are profit motivated,
go in to get economic gains. And we see that there is no incentive for them to train new workers when they bring in people who already have that expertise from their own countries. Thank you, sir. We say that therefore the transfer of knowledge is something that really isn't going to occur. And we say that regardless of the example of ExxonMobil that builds schools in the countries and which its factories are built, many other countries go in simply to build their factories and simply to get the goods out without actually caring about the social, caring about the social situation in that country because and precisely because of the profit motive. So having that, let me move on. Thank you, sir. My third point of contention, that would be on the idea. Thank you, sir, on the whole idea of diversity of languages as well as bridging this cultural inequality, and this will include the idea of the brain drain. So what they have come up to us is that they've tried to prove to us that diversity in terms of languages is beneficial, but we say that this is not true because the two-way transfer in terms of diversity is not of an equal degree. And because it's not of an equal degree, the dilution and the domination of a particular country, of a particular culture, is something that we cannot tolerate. And it's a result of a perpetuation of inequity through globalization. Furthermore, on the whole idea of the brain drain and adjustment, we say that their whole assertion that it won't happen rests on the assumption that the development or the progress of nations is proportionate. Or you say that it's not. It's because of the disproportionality of the development that the brain drain will occur because some countries develop further, and we have already shown you this to be a counterpart of the first world. And my final point of this contention on the whole idea of economic development on the part of the third world, we say that no, MNCs that go into these countries will use certain production techniques that capitalize on the way in which they can transfer all their returns to the country of origin. For example, the Australian Commonwealth Energy Corporation built factories in Eastern Africa to basically build solar panels. And what this happened was they brought in their own skilled workers without actually hiring any African workers, and this roots out the idea of employment opportunities. And furthermore, they did not gain in terms of land revenue because they did not actually have to pay any Africans for the land because of a certain caveat within an international treaty regarding the land place. Because of this example, ladies and gentlemen, we say the GNPs of first world nations are going to increase disproportionately from the GDPs of those foreign nations in which the factories are built. So having shown you on all three counts, culturally, politically, as well as economically, in the international scale, how there is inequity that's going to be perpetuated by globalization, let me now show you how even internationally, within countries, especially within developed countries, there is going to be social inequity that's perpetuated by globalization. And we recognize that inequity exists between nations actually, varying in terms of those nations who have varying socio-economic as well as socio-political status. And in my constructive, now let me prove to you how we need not look so far out into the international scene to witness the perpetuation of social inequity. Therefore, my label for this point will be the perpetuation of social inequity within the societies of developed nations. Now, just as my first speaker, in the moment Madam did, I will prove social inequity on the international level to becomes cultural, politics, as well as economics. But before I move on, yes, madam.
So what we have to talk about here is the inequity that is actually between the developing countries and the developed countries. And you have not shown us why this is so.
I have already shown you, if you have been listening, on all three counts, that there is a discrepancy between these three nations, between the first world as well as the third world. So let me show you how now on the international level this also exists. So globalization basically contributes to the existence of the divide between these nations in the first area of culture. In the process of growing into developed nations, the societies within these developed nations experience inequity in the way some groups of people in society do not benefit as much as others. Now, the process of globalization has perpetuated this inequity even further in the way that those who were in an advantageous position to begin with now have more ability to capitalize on this position, leaving those who are less advantaged even further behind. For example, in the United States of America, which is the epitome of a developed nation, certain cultural groups experience inequity even as globalization has helped culturally superior groups advance further ahead. Now, this can be seen as in how the African American as well as Hispanic communities have had their cultures imposed upon and diluted by the Caucasian American culture, particularly in today's rapidly globalizing paradigm. On the second count, on the idea of politics, the same degree of inequity can be seen in this realm. For example, in England's House of Ministers, domination of the Labour and Conservative government has meant that weaker political groups with other political interests have no equal degree of influence or clout. And the same can be said when we take culture and politics in the same breath, that the indigenous communities in New Zealand have experienced a severe discrepancy in the volume of political voice that they have. Now, globalisation has perpetuated this social inequity in the realms of politics in a way that has allowed the people who had more influence to begin with have an even greater degree of clout in today's world. Now, on the third count, economics, as mentioned, the growth in income of the top 20% of Japan's wealth holders has risen by $880 million in the last 3 quarters of the last fiscal year, compared to the 14% of those who have only risen by one out of 400 of the same fraction. We say that this is a similar discrepancy that we experience and an inequity that has been perpetuated by globalization. It's because of these reasons that we say war on the side of the proposition.
Now, thanks the second proposition speaker from the speakers.
It is very interesting to see that the proposition and their first and second speaker are actually talking about the same things, but in 2 different levels. Firstly, in the country itself, and secondly, in the global scale. And of course, my first speaker has already told you why the benefits already fall between the countries. And naturally, the benefits within the country also falls. But let's deal with it anyway. Firstly, the benefits within the country, and secondly, on a national level between the countries. Let's first deal with the within the countries. But before that, let's deal with the definition. Well, they just kept coming up to tell us that the definitions are very important, and that is why we say that the social inequity point must be dealt with culture, social, and political. And we have already shown you all 3 points are interlinked, and that is why my first speaker has really dealt with that. And also the main focus of today's debate is to deal with why the wealth is actually so unequal in today's society because of globalization, and the proposition has not dealt with that, and hence we have failed as a proposition. Let's now view the first point within the nation, the benefits within the nation. Firstly, they talk to us about how now these cultures, these minorities within the country will tend to suffer as a result of globalization. But they have not told us why so. All they just come out and tell us asserting facts that firstly, these countries, thank you sir, these people within the country would just suffer just because of globalization. Have they told us why? We see there's an inherent logic flaw within the proposition case. And even so, even if there's a logic link within the proposition case, we say that firstly, it is because of globalization, it resulted in the inequity being bridged within the country. Why so? Because what happens is that now there's more mix of cultures within the country. Because, ladies and gentlemen, globalization has allowed the countries, the developing countries, to know, thank you sir, that there is a presence of actually labor rights. They know, thank you sir, these countries will now know, because of globalization, they will now know that United States actually have a very strong labor right movement. And that is why they are now taking the precedence from these other countries, from developed countries, because of globalization coming in. And that is why now these people within the country would have a better set of living. Thank you sir, because now the rights, the freedoms can actually be protected within the country itself. And that is why we see within the country all the benefits are protected and social inequity is not perpetuated or entrenched. And that's why we say the benefits within the nation are really flawed. Let's deal with the second point about how there's a dilution, between the countries there's actually benefits. Now my first speaker has really dealt with that, but let's just talk about it once again. Firstly, they talk to us about how these countries, the developing countries will tend to lose out just because the MNCs are just going to come in and they have no incentive to train on labor. Firstly, we say that these countries, precisely because they're profit motivated, they are going to train the labor in the developing countries. Why so? Because, no, thank you sir, because these people, these MNCs, when they come into your country, what happens is they plan to stay for a long time because they created the infrastructure, they created the headquarters there. And that is why they would have the incentive to train your labor because they would need a sustaining labor force within your developing countries. And that is why we say it will benefit, in a moment sir, it will benefit the local countries. Yes sir.
Madam, telling us that the MNCs will stay in there for a long time does not prove anything because the third world nation will still be at disadvantage.
Thank you sir. I haven't already told you that these MNCs, when they come in, when they actually plan to stay a long time, they need to sustain the local training force. And that is why they would have the incentive to build out the infrastructure right. And that is why they would have the incentive to build the skills right. And that is why we say that the local people will actually tend to benefit. Now also they also talk to us about how there'll be a dilution of culture somehow when you have globalization. Firstly, we see there's no dilution because we see that when globalization sets in, what you have is that now you increase your global awareness of more cultures. Because no, thank you, sir. Because now you know there are more cultures around, and I have already told you that because there are more cultures, you are likely to know that there are more things out there, there are more rights that you can actually achieve through all these cultures. And that is why we say that globalization has resulted in more benefits than detriments, and it has not perpetuated the social inequity. Now, how can that look like? Let me move on to my case. Firstly, on the notion of how there's a two-way check for developing and developed countries, which is actually increasing global awareness, and secondly, increasing international diplomacy. Let's first deal with the first point, on the notion of how there's a two-way check between developed and developing countries, increasing global awareness. Previously, without globalization, what happens is that countries actually practice isolationist policies when no country actually knew what was happening beyond the country, which is what the proposition actually seems to want. And this actually results in little investment within the country and little influences from the outside world. Was that good? No, thank you, sir. We see that we take the example of USSR, whereby they actually practice an isolationist policy, and in the end, what happened is the economy suffered as a result. The people did not know that there was such thing as human rights, and therefore the people actually suffered. But what happens with the onset of globalization? What happens is the increase of interaction and the opening up of societies. Because what happens is that now, because there's an increase of understanding and awareness of society, it results in the exchange of ideas coming into play. Yes, sir.
Deal with how the influence that different countries use is disproportionate, and therefore we say globalization has increased the inequity
Thank
that
you, sir.
exists.
We don't have to deal whether the influences are disproportionate or not. But what we have to do is whether the influences are good or not, and whether it benefits the people ultimately. And I'll be explaining to that in my case, and therefore be patient, sir. Well, what we must understand is because of the exchange of ideas, now these developing and developed countries actually act as a check for each other. Why so? Because now developing countries can actually take the role model for the developed countries, and now you are able to understand the importance of human rights. Oh, thank you, sir. The importance of freedom. And that is why the capitalistic ideas can actually come into developing countries and benefit the people ultimately. And also what happens is that they also act as a check for the developed countries. Why so? Because now the developing countries are going to come here and say that, well, the developed countries told us that we can't do this, and that's why we're doing this. And therefore this acts as a check and balance for two-way transfer. And when we have the developed and the developing countries acting as a check for each other, because now what happens is that it benefits both parties because the human rights is enforced, and that is why we say it benefits both parties. As we take the example of China, whereby before globalization, it was actually very close up and actually significant human rights abuses. But what happened is that when they actually opened up, globalization set in, it resulted in the economy being dependent on the image, and they were forced to improve their human rights. They were forced to improve the standard of the living of the people, and that is why we say it benefits the people. On to my second point, the increase of international diplomacy. In the old times, the developed and developing countries no longer have an equal platform to bargain with. Because what happens is that there is no point of actually negotiating. But what happens is that when you have globalization, what happens is that you have an interdependency taking place. Because now both countries are actually relying on each other for trade. Because what happens is that developing countries have the resources, have the natural resources, as well as labor, while the developed countries have skilled labor and technology. And that is why we see there's a two-way transfer, where now both countries come into play, increase global trade and increase globalization. And this results in increase of diplomacy. Why so? Because now countries are more willing to come together, to come and negotiate instead of resulting in conflicts with each other. And that is why we take the example of India and United States, whereby they're actually willing to come together to negotiate instead of fighting against each other. And that is why we say that globalization does not perpetuate social inequity, but it actually bridges the gap between the rich and the poor.
The House thanks the second opposition speaker for her speech. The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 7 seconds. second speaker for the proposition will now wrap up the case for the proposition.
Now let's clear up the definition clarification once and for all. What the opposition today has misunderstood about the proposition is simply on the definition of social inequity. They left out the clarification my first speaker had mentioned. They were not saying that third world nations have not benefited at all. But ladies and gentlemen, at the rate of growth of third world nations, the first world nations have also grown as well. And because the rate of growth of first world nations is so much faster, we tell you that there is still a gap. And on the contrary, this gap is actually widening, members of this House. That is the problem that our proposition today wants to deal with. It's not whether or not third world nations have benefited or not, but rather whether or not the social inequity, this gap of income inequality based on based on the economy, based on the culture, and based on the politics have been ripped. And what the opposition today have merely been coming to say is simply that the world have benefited and globalization is a good thing. But they have not proven to us how it has solved social inequity. And even to their second speaker today, members of this House, they have not dealt with my first speaker's substantive on political clout, members of this House. And what the second speaker had just really asserted or evaded our question on the second speaker's substantive, the intra-country members of the House, the problems within the country, they have merely evaded the question by simply saying the logic is the same as inter-countries. Anytime it is not, and we challenge the third speakers to come up and deal with the substantive. So allow me to now move on to my three contentions. Firstly, on the economical aspect of social inequity. Secondly, on the cultural aspect. And lastly, on Jazlyn's point, on the two-way check. So first, on the economical aspect. Today they tell us that third world nations do benefit simply because they have jobs. And they compare it within themselves, members of this House. They compare it between before and after. The proposition tells you today that the comparison should be with the first world nations against the third world nations and not within themselves. And therefore it put forth to you that this is not answering the motion. But even then, they tell us that companies will stay in there a long time. But precisely, members of this House, precisely because they will stay there a long time, that this gap will definitely widen within a long time. It's precisely because they will continue to stay there that they extrapolate the resources of these third world nations and continue taking the advantage further on their side instead of the third world nations, that this gap will continue to widen. We tell today's example of US GDP of $41,800 against Nigeria's $900 of GDP. But even then, we put forth to you the difference between GNP and GDP. And GDP is merely the geographical profit gain. Therefore, we tell you that even though MNCs come to the third world nations, the profits will finally go to the source of origin, the countries of origin, members of this House. Therefore, the profits of the MNCs will be on the first world nations, ladies and gentlemen, and not the third world. And therefore, this gap will continue to widen. We put forth to you that while the third world nations are suffering from starvation and whatnot, we see first world nations are trying to combat problems of obesity. We give you the EU agriculture plan, whereby they have beef and butter mountains and wine lakes, while the third world nations are suffering from poverty. This is precisely the economical difference and widening gap that you see in our society that is a cause because of globalization. Then moving on to the brain drain. They assume to us that people do not want to go to another country, but this is not so. Precisely because of the dominant mindset of the westernization that my first speaker has clarified in his substantive. We give the example of out-migrations from developing countries such as India and China of minus 1.7% compared to US where there's increase of population of 2.3% based on migration. And this is because of brain drain, members of this House. Members of this House will give you another example of the Human Development Index, whereby it is a criteria based on literacy, infant mortality rates, and life expectancy, where Ethiopia, the bottom 10 countries are mainly all based in Africa, members of this House, while the top 10 countries of HDI are all from Western nations. This, members of this House, is the widening gap that you see in our society. And this is a continued trend of 20 years, members of this House. 20 years and the African nations are still at the bottom 10. This, members of this House, is how globalization has not solved our problem today. So, moving on to my second contention on culture, members of this House. We put forth to you that there will be a dilution of culture simply because of the dominant mindset already input in the people that Western culture is definitely the better culture. Yes, sir.
And yet you're willing to let these African nations continue to remain at the bottom of the Human Development Index because you refuse the MNCs who can come in and provide education and jobs and
thank you, sir. Once again, we see how the opposition has misunderstood the criteria of this debate. It's not whether or not we want globalization or we do not want globalization. It's an analysis of, at the end of the day, whether we see globalization has definitely shortened the gap between the social economy welfare of the third nation and the first world nations. Moving on to my cultural point of view, they tell us that there was to be a cross diversification of culture. But members of this house, we put forth to you that this is merely the commercialization of culture. When culture, for example, Thailand, are reduced to merely commodities and commercialization on the first world nations point of view. And therefore, we put forth to you that the transfer is not proportionate in the sense that the Western culture at the end of the day is still more dominant than the many local art scenes in Thailand. We put forth to you other examples like the Hawaiian opera that have been subsumed simply because of globalization. Ladies and gentlemen, we put forth that even though the first speaker said that people will actually continue taking foreign language, we tell you at the end of the day, people will still consider the practical ramifications of which language they rather choose. And we tell you that they would rather choose English at the end of the day because that is the economical power bite that will bring them most benefits. And therefore, in this house, we tell you that this language will be subsumed away, and it is not a very fair representation of diversification of culture that the opposition would like to believe today. Moving on to my last contention, on that of Jazlyn's point on the two-way check. Members of this house, they tell us that the developed countries and developing countries will cross-check among themselves. However, they have not proven us the incentive for the developing nations to even check the developed nations in the first place. Simply because that if the first world nations really do have the economical mind, we tell you what is the incentive for developing nations to even want to go against these first world nations who might possibly sanction them in some ways and further decrease their power. We tell today at the end of the day that the first world nation is not solely dependent on the third world nations for resources as they like to believe, simply because the first world nations do have their own resources in the first place. But even then, because of technological advances of the first world nation, for example, hydroponics, for example, aeroponics, we tell that the first world nations can very well sustain themselves as well. Therefore, it is the incentive of the third world nations, ironically, to therefore, on the contrary, to therefore so-called go with the first world nations instead of going against them. And that is precisely the point that the opposition have not rebutted today. That are the political clout, members of this house. What my first speaker in his first speech had already mentioned, the political clout that the third world nations do not have against the first world nations. Furthermore, we tell you that at the end of the day, the exchange of ideas is not there, simply because of the already Western-dominated mindset and the influence of different countries is really disproportional, as what my second speaker already mentioned in his POI. Therefore, at the end of the day, we challenge the third speaker to come up with proper criteria against the debate today, to discuss on the analysis of the globalization and not whether or not globalization is a good thing or bad thing, based on the three criteria: socially, economically, politically, and culturally. Thank you.
It is clearly a very disappointing thing that today in our world, where 1 in 5 people live below the international poverty line, 20% of our world, and mostly considering the third world that they have been so concerned about, and yet they're ignoring the very methods of globalization that have been helping to pull these people out of their plight. And therefore, because of these problems, we have shown you in our first second speakers already why globalization is a good force and has helped to bridge the social inequity that we've been talking about today. But before I move on to my contentions, let me show you the problems of their case first. Their first and second speakers said that there are no benefits to globalization whatsoever. And yet their third speaker came out next and said benefits do exist. But what we need to do is to prove that the first world, in fact, is benefiting more than the third world. Now, place a big case shift on their stance, but let me emphasize what we're proving again today. Today, we've already stressed before that it's impossible to compare the growth and development on the first world and the third world together. What we need to prove is that the gap between the first and the third world is beginning and has been bridged already because of the process of globalization, therefore solving the problem of social inequity. And because of they have not proven their side of the case, we are going to show that their motion is going to fall. No, thank you, sir. Let me show you this in 3 contentions. First, let me handle international politics. Secondly, on the issue of cultural dilution. And thirdly, on the economical gap that exists today. Let's begin with international politics, which, if I may emphasize, my second speaker already dealt with despite the third speaker's accusation. But let me clarify for you once more. Now, when they say today that countries with more wealth and more power have greater political clout in the international community, they clearly are wrong. Because today, the third world has even more greater political clout than before because of globalization. Why? Because previously, we must understand they have absolutely no voice at all whatsoever. And yet today, with globalization in action, with MNCs from the first world all inside the third world is now gaining greater political power in this international scene. And because of their increasing wealth, because of globalization's good effects, we can see that now the third world is gaining far more stature in the international community and gaining much more influence as a result. We see third world countries sitting on communities like the Human Rights Council, for example. We see third world countries communicating with first world countries in the Security Council. We see so many signs of cooperation between the first and the third world, and we say therefore the gap is bridged, ladies and gentlemen. And because the social inequity has been solved, we say their point already false. Now, then they tell us today that the first has no incentive to check the third world in anything like, say, human rights, because they're self-sufficient. Let me remind today that in our globalized world, there's absolutely no understanding of self-sufficiency anymore. Today, the first world has MNCs and bases all across the third world, all across the globe itself. And therefore, today we see increasingly interdependent and globalized world coming into place. And therefore, there's definitely a lot of reason why the first world has not incentive to protect the third world, especially in the United Nations, international community as a result. So therefore, I do not see why the social inequity gap has not been bridged. Let me move on to the second contention today on the issue of culture. Now today they claim to us that culture and languages are being subverted by the developed world, and therefore the third world's languages and cultures are now being diluted altogether. Yes, sir?
On the idea of deal with the fact that the influence is different in the United Nations Security Council when people with more money views are more widely heard than that of the developing nations.
Sir, you're clearly wrong here today, because we see several third world countries leading the councils they're talking about today. We have countries like Libya, for example, leading the Human Rights Council. We have third world countries inside Security Council discussing with the bigger nations like the United States, like China, like Russia, all on international security issues, solving problems ranging from North Korea all the way to social issues that happen in the third world. So because of all these things, we see as greater cooperation. And when you see a sign of cooperation, this is the gap beginning to be bridged already. The social equity that existed before without globalization has never been solved. But let me go back to my point on culture. Now, we are showing now that the developer actually is greater incentive to protect the third world's culture. And why? Because they realize that when you protect developing world's culture and create greater communication to solve the barriers and problems that now exist in the gap in the first and the third world. Because of this, because we tend to cooperate even more now in the third world, we see that the first world has greater incentive to protect their culture. We saw this example when BBC hosted the African Radio Awards, helping promote the Africans who have been contributing greatly to their nation's radio stations. In fact, even when they talk about American channels dominating the third world, we see why is that the bad thing in the first place? Let's compare this in the first place. Look at the third world now and see how much information really gets there in the first place. Because of globalization today, we have accurate information coming across the globe, all across the Atlantic, to the third world, to Africa, to countries which need this information the most, to people who need to know about their rights and their privileges that they should be given by their governments. In fact, many third world governments today, in fact, try to masquerade their so-called culture by hiding corruption beneath it. In fact, this happens in Papua New Guinea, where the Prime Minister, Sir Michael, constantly says, when criticized by the First World, that this is our culture, that they don't understand our culture. This is clearly a great excuse for the severe corruption that today still plagues Papua New Guinea's severely economic crisis. And because of these problems, we see that this culture cannot be used as a shield on their side. In fact, today, the developed world has even more incentive whatsoever to protect the third world's culture, and because of this, social inequity is thus breached. No, thank you, sir. Now, when they say, therefore, that certain cultural groups in the first world are still marginalized because of the forces of globalization, we say that at least culture has created greater awareness for these groups. For example, we look at Australia, where the Australian government was forced to stop trying to downplay Aborigine culture because of